Hello, Taylor. Welcome to the Wax Museum.
Hola, or wie geht's? I'm in Germany right now, so ich
Wie
muss
geht's?
ein bisschen Deutsch sprechen. I should
Yeah.
speak a little German, maybe.
Yeah, my mother speaks German, actually. My mother was born in
Wow,
Germany.
wow, that's
Mm-hmm.
cool. What part?
Krefeld, I believe.
Dude, that's where my family's from.
Really? Very
Yeah,
cool. Yeah, they
yeah.
left, I think 1950, like around there. So,
My family left 1680.
wow, that's a
Yeah,
long time ago. So you're like very American.
yeah, yes, actually. Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, as American as a white person could be, which
Mm,
never thought about
yeah,
it that way.
yeah, that's true. So the reason why you're on the Wax Museum today is we were going to talk about socialism, and I'm just
Oh,
convinced that those on the right just don't know enough about socialism to actually critique it, and it's just such a straw man thing they got going on. Um, so I asked the question on Facebook: can somebody give me a positive example of socialism? And as expected, 90% of people thought they were super clever and saying, there isn't one. And I was like, yeah, okay, I've heard all of that. And I was actually listening to a podcast where a guy was like saying, these people want socialism. What's a positive example of socialism? And the guy's like, there isn't. And I was like, okay, he hasn't done his research clearly.
yeah,
Because to say that the entire left is stupid is ridiculous, just like
right.
saying the entire right is stupid. And so I'm like, so I really wanted to delve into this. And I was thinking, if my listeners are like listening to this and they're like, oh, I need to speak up about this, I'm like, have some fun on the Facebook page and give us some comments and we'll talk. And if there's enough pushback on this, I'd be happy to talk capitalism with the capitalist. So
There you go.
one of the articles that I read, so there was like, I think there were like three people, including you, who had given me some really good resources that kind of shed a positive light on socialism. So one of the articles I read talked about how it all kind of started, with feudalism and people being discontented or, yeah, being unhappy with feudalism. And there was really no upward mobility. Um, like, do you think there was any upward mobility at all with feudalism?
I mean, I'm trying to think like if you were really attractive,
Mm.
and the king wanted you or something, I did, and I know being in Germany, one of the kings here was gay, one of the big
Oh.
kings in this area. So if you were attractive male, and if you're attractive woman, that's the only thing I could think of, if you were the
Mm.
right, if they wanted you for that reason. But other than that, I don't think that they're going to invest in you to make you particularly educated. Um, yeah, so I don't think there's any upward mobility in feudalism that I know of. I mean, maybe somebody could comment, but don't. I don't think so. And that was kind of the conclusion you came to as well,
For
right?
sure. So basically, following that discontent, there was the French Revolution, the capitalist revolution. Like, and I really have not studied anything on the French Revolution. But from what I understand, basically there was guillotines like killing all the powerful. And
Yeah,
so the capitalist revolution kind of spread after that too, where they were trying to emulate what they saw in France.
yeah, and I'm not sure that it was like exactly the capitalist revolution, but it was like a revolution against the monarchy,
Mm-hmm.
which had become, I think that's the infamous line. Someone told them, oh, they don't have any bread, and then they said, oh, let them eat cake.
Right.
And so it was just, they were so out of touch with the peasantry. And so, yeah, they overthrew the monarchy. And the question was, okay, what's going to happen after that? The reign of terror happened, where they
Mm.
just started cutting everybody's head off. That was like,
Yeah.
it was real nasty for a while. And somehow out of that, Napoleon uh, came out of it. And then he was even exiled himself, came back. It was kind of messy. But I think that it was like 50 years later that it became clear that those with the most private wealth were becoming dominant again. So then that's when I think capitalism started to be being used. And I think, as far as I know, like I really haven't studied this out super a ton. But I think it was derogatory to use it back then, because like, oh, you believe in private wealth. If ism, it means a belief. Then it's like, oh, you trust those with private wealth. Like if they have their own big house, or they have, the merchants or whatever have all this money now all of a sudden because they don't have to pay to a king. So they became the dominant ones. And especially with the Industrial Revolution, if you owned a factory, you were about to be very wealthy.
Yeah.
So then that's where the Richard Wolff thing comes in, that particular lecture that I shared with you.
Yeah, that was really good.
And he's one of the very few Marxist. Actually, I'm trying to think if I think he does call himself a Marxist, or his Wikipedia page says he's a Marxian. And so I'm kind of
Marxian.
For those who are familiar with,
I'm
like,
not
the
a
emerging...
Marxist. I'm a Marxian.
Right. And now there's this thing that's like, I'm not a communist. I'm a communitarianist.
Ooh.
Or I'm not a pantheist. I'm a panentheist.
Oh, yeah, I was just waiting for the Richard Rohr thing to come up. Yeah, I was like, yeah, totally. It's like, whatever, man.
So I looked up like panentheism recently, and it's like, oh, Ralph Waldo Emerson was a panentheist. And I'm like, well, I mean, they called him a pantheist. He called himself a pantheist. It's like, I think they just made up a new term to be like, I'm not like the people that you think,
Labels are so weird. Like, honestly,
yeah.
I've decided, I'm like, y'all can label me. I don't care. I'm just not going to go with a label.
Sure. So anyways, I think he is nevertheless somehow influenced by Marx. Richard Wolff is. And this was a very rare thing for someone to make it through academia during the Cold War and be an out and out Marxist. And even to this day, it's still like, it's the right wing. And I was part of the right wing. I was homeschooled K through 12. I grew up on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. I read the Bible every day. I listened to Rush Limbaugh and everything, Michael Savage every day of my life. I went to a conservative Christian university where we had no Democrats on campus. We had a Republican group on campus. So I was, I wore a George Bush t-shirt in 2004. I voted Libertarian actually in every single presidential election I've been eligible to vote for. I voted Libertarian. I didn't want to do that last time, but whatever. But I didn't want to vote for Hillary either because I thought she was maybe not so. And I was in California, so I knew it was going to go Democrat, so I decided to vote third party just as like kind of a protest vote.
Right.
But where was I? About there's a thing on the right, like where, and Jordan Peterson was big on this. He says, the academy is controlled by postmodern neo-Marxists.
Right. I hear that a lot. Yes.
And he debated Zizek, and Zizek said, he asked him like, okay, who are these people? Because he's like, he's like, I'm a Hegelian Marxist. And so it's a little bit different than what people think when they think Marxist. But he said, who are these people? Because he's like, when I write recommendations for people, they don't get jobs. Because he's seen as a Marxist. And so Marxists, out and out Marxists, can't really get jobs. It's a liberal controlled academia, and Marxists are not liberals. They're like fundamentally different. So they share some things, like, they would say Black Lives Matter. They would say gay marriage should not be a question, but Marxists are it's an economics thing. It's not identity politics. So a very liberal does not mean Marxist. And Marxist means 100 million things to 100 million different people. So it's like you're saying with the labels, it's kind of like almost pointless to use it, but somehow influenced by Marx. And Richard Wolff would be the one that's like an actual Marxist, one of the very few. Another one is Frederick Jameson. But like other than them two, it's like hard to find a straight up Marxist in the academy. Anyways, but he has this talk that you watched and that I watched called Socialism for Dummies. He explains that Marx likes the French Revolution. He likes liberty, fraternity, equality, which were the ideals of the French Revolution. But Marx says, actually, this isn't going to get us there. Like we're giving way too much power to people with private wealth.
Right.
We're giving way too much power to the people who own the factories. And so what we need to do is we need to get the workers organized. And then he wrote, the Communist Manifesto in 1848, workers of the world, unite. The only thing we have to lose is our chains. So he was hoping that, and he actually saw it as inevitable. He thought, because this was Hegel's contribution, his teacher, Hegel said that we're on this march of history and it's inevitable. There will be progress no matter what. Mm-hmm. Hegel thought it was going to happen in the realm of ideas. And Marx said, screw your ideas. If you go to the University of Berlin, I've done it on a number of occasions. I'm studying mostly at Potsdam, which is next to Berlin, but I have taken classes at the University of Berlin. You walk in and there's a big quote from Marx, and it says, in German, it says, philosophers up until now have only analyzed the world. The point is to change it. So Hegel was an idealist, and he thought everything happened in the realm of ideas. And Marx said, no, I'm a materialist. For me, it's all about the, material things. And so that's why he brought him towards economics, because he was like looking at how does our material conditions influence the way we think, rather than how the way we think influence our material conditions. And probably some like actual Marxists will like tear me up on that definition, but it's functional. Okay, it's it works in some ways. That's historical materialism. It's this inevitable march of progress. And so Marx and Engels thought, okay, what's going to happen is the same thing that happened in the French Revolution. These capitalists are going to get super wealthy, and they're going to distance themselves from the workers because they want to pay the workers less and less and less and less. But the workers are going to realize this, and they're going to overthrow the capitalists, and we're going to have a socialist community. We're going to have a belief in society rather than a belief in the wealthiest. But when that wealth inequality happened, instead of choosing socialism, they chose barbarism. And that was the Hitler moment in Germany. And so this is where like the idea of a neo-Marxist comes from, is because, and there's a particular school of thought called the Frankfurt School, and they're currently the evangelical Christian boogeyman, that's called critical theory.
Right.
And they said their starting point was, what did Marx get wrong? Why did it not become a belief in society? Why did they choose to kill a minority instead? Why did they choose to blame a minority? And so this guy, Theodor Adorno, he writes this text called Education After Auschwitz. And he says, the number one demand on education is that Auschwitz never happen again. So then that's also where, because Hitler is a fascist. And so communists are for poor people, and socialists, the only difference that I'm aware of, at least at that time, is that communists thought that they were not able to work through the system. And socialists said, no, we are going to work through the system. And there was a particular party. There's a woman named Rosa Luxemburg who's really influential. This was in Berlin in the early 1900s. And she was all about, no, we're going to do this peacefully. We're going to work within the system to realize a more socialist, maybe not exclusively a socialist immediately, but we're going to create a more socialist society. And it's a big messy like controversy, but she was taken and killed. Her and another leader of this particular movement was taken and killed. And I think the consensus is that it was the communists actually that killed her. The ones that thought we will not work with the system. Like the system will never reform itself. And so they got rid of the peaceful socialist. Um, and that was in the early, I think 1919, but she was very famous for saying the inequality will grow until we have to choose either socialism or barbarism. And then of course, like 20 years later, that's exactly what happened. Germany chose barbarism. Interestingly, the United States, we elected FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Right.
And so his policies were not exactly socialist, but they were headed that direction.
Right.
The New Deal stuff, basically he taxed the wealthy a whole bunch and invested in poor and working people.
And my understanding is that's when, that's basically when the backlash against socialism really erupted, right? Is that the powerful were like, we don't like the New Deal. And so it's almost like they set like this propaganda machine in place. And it's just staggering to me to see how, like, I'm Canadian, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you knew that, but
I did know that. Yeah. I keep saying we, and I'm like, me,
but it's like, it's interesting to me how communism and socialism is such a swear word in America, where in Canada, like there are some people that get upset over those, but it's not demonized like it is in the United States. And you probably see that different in Germany too.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's crazy because there are 6 main parties in Germany, and like the Democrats align with like the center right party. And then you have like AOC and Bernie Sanders, this progressive wing of the United States. And they really like, there's kind of a center left party, the Social Democrats, that you'd probably put them in that party if they were in Germany. But there's another party that's further left than that called the Die Linke, and they win a ton of very prominent, like, and all the things that AOC and Bernie, college tuition, public health care. I mean, Canada has public health care. It's not a crazy idea. We go to US Americans go to Canada to buy insulin because it's cheaper. So yeah, it's just, I have even conservative Christians in Germany that like look at me, they're like, why does everybody keep voting against public health care? Like, don't you get it? And I'm like, we have weird, the Cold War did a number on us,
I think what's interesting too about that, because I was just doing a Facebook, like one of those Facebook room things, and there were a bunch of people there, and we started talking about universal health care. And my buddy Jimmy had said, the problem with universal health care is that for America, this would be such a revolutionary change. And when you think about like how you have 4-year terms, it's like you got 8 years of Obama trying to make that happen. And then you got Trump comes in and it's like, let's scrap all that. And so it's like so difficult to make headway unless you have like kind of a long-term Democrat.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could maybe, and if we're still like go back to socialism, just to talk about, there's kind of 2 definitions, and I'm really only defending one of them. I'm interested in the second, but so I'm just really defending it etymologically in that, so if capitalism means the belief in private wealth, or some maybe better to say the prioritization of private wealth, because I think capitalists are also socialists. They just put their belief in society is much lower than their belief in capital.
Yeah, it's not binary, is it?
No, I don't think so. And I mean, you have East Germany where, I'm living now, 30 years ago was communist, but they still made pro-capital decisions.
Right.
They still made even fascist decisions. So if you're going to say fascism, I would say fascism is the demonizing of the weak, or
Right.
unproductive or a minority that you don't like. It's the strong ganging up on the weak. And then you have like a communism or a socialism tends to be the weak against the powerful, or minorities against the powerful.
Right.
That's what it tends to be. So that's the idea of socialism that I'm defending is a belief in society. And I think conservatives actually have this. Even when you say make America great again, that is a socialist slogan. Now, I don't think Trump is doing that.
No. Well, and I mean,
but
as a Canadian, when I
too.
see that, I see it as a capitalist slogan where he's like, I want America to be first out of all the nations and be the most powerful and be winning. Make all the other nations losers, right? And so it's like, wow. Like and I think, Christians, evangelicals within the United States kind of look at that and saying, he wants to take care of our own. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I want to take care of my family. And I'm just like, I don't know. A lot of this it's tribalism. And when you're on the outside of it, you're like, oh, that just seems so selfish. Like, it's so hard for me to see that as Christianity.
Oh yeah. It's insane.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to use an extreme example because I think that he's appealing to people's socialist sensibilities, maybe, because I think we all have this. Even like, I think if we prioritize our family over profit, that's probably one of the few things that we still prioritize over profit is usually family.
Yeah.
And so to me, that is a socialist sensibility because you're putting people over profit. Now, I wish it would extend beyond our family. But that to me is in the direction. It's a very small step, a step that almost everyone takes. But to me, that's a socialist, a belief in society, or a communist even. It's a belief in community. It's prioritization of community. So that to me is one definition of socialism. The textbook definition of socialism is workers, the people, workers owning the means of production.
Right.
Yeah. So that would mean like the electrical company would be owned by the community, and the community is represented in government. So then that's where I guess conservatives get really upset, is that they don't want the government in control. But when you say that to a socialist also doesn't usually like the government. If you read basically any socialist writing, when I first got to Germany, actually, there's a full-on communist bar down the street from where I go to school. And above it is a massive banner that said, "Never trust the government." And I was like, I thought communists were pro-government.
Yes, exactly.
And I quickly realized, no, communists are pro-community. So it's also, Theodore Parker was an American who was he was influenced by the same people that Marx was influenced by. And he's the one who said the phrase, "We want a government of the people, by the people, for the people."
Right.
So that terminology is essentially, I mean, that's the American expression of communism, or American expression of socialism. A government of the people, by the people, for the people. And so like Martin Luther King, for example, argued that had never happened. Because when we said all men are created equal and are endowed by a creator with inalienable rights, we definitely meant men. We definitely meant white men. We definitely meant, actually not even white, is Western European only. It's like you had to be English, German, French, Swedish.
And not Irish.
Yeah, Irish doesn't count.
Yeah.
Until later, we need to create like a separation between other colors of skin. So yeah, it was Western European. You had to own land. Which that was the problem with my family. We didn't own land. So we were always kind of we were part of this continually migrating westward group of people. But yeah, of the people, by the people, for the people. And Abraham Lincoln quoted Theodore Parker. People don't realize that. But
Yeah.
it was a quote of Theodore Parker, who was this preacher in the, gosh, the 1830s, 1840s, I think, was his heyday. But yeah, so that's kind of a communist phrase, of the people, by the people, for the people. When a communist
That's
is
intriguing.
usually against the government,
Right.
but they are for the community. So when they say they're against the government, it usually means like the punishing parts of the government, the parts of the government that are going to come and take your guns away. Even a lot, many communists and socialists, probably the majority, are pro-gun, actually.
Really?
Yeah. It's liberals that are that tend to be anti-gun. I think, yeah, socialists are pretty divided on this. And you'll notice like Bernie Sanders is, I mean, he wanted to like regulate some of assault rifles, but a lot of socialists don't like that part. And in Vermont, the gun laws are not crazy, and he doesn't advocate for yeah. So, but communists tend to be against communist socialists. I'm using those terms interchangeably, and there are distinctions, but in this, we're trying to recover an actual sense of what socialism is: a belief in society,
Right.
or workers owning the means of production, the people owning the means of production, the people being represented. So even the American phrase, "no taxation without representation," a communist government, like a true communist government, and that's annoying too, because we have to go through all the things that pop up in our head, like Venezuela and China and Stalinists and Maoists and all this stuff. Yeah. So yeah, it's about representation, though. It should be about representation. The government should reflect the community, and if it doesn't reflect the community, then they're against it.
So I mean, that I think that comes from the difference between revolutionary change and evolutionary change. And it's like when you bring revolutionary change, you have to take hold of the government to reorder society. And there's been multiple examples where it's revolutionary change, but the change never really happens. And they move from a capitalistic society to a like government controlled capitalistic society.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think like China is the good example of that. I think I lived there for a year, actually. I taught English in China for a year. And yeah, it's a capital centric society. I think, yeah, there's the amount of billionaires in China is a lot. And so people use the Communist Party to be authoritarian. And yeah, you can use any power structure to be authoritarian. So this is also why a lot of like, I think the ideal, like there's this guy, David Bentley Hart. Have you heard of him? He's a theologian.
I've heard of him. Yeah, I'm not totally familiar with his work, but yeah.
Yeah, well, he wrote a great article. I mean, he was somehow, people were speculating about his politics and saying that he was pro-Trump or something, and he said, "Excuse me, I've only ever been a part of one party my whole life, and it's the Democratic Socialists of America." And he's like, "And I only do that because I think that's realistic." But he's like, "In reality, I'm an anarcho-communist. Like that's where I want to go. I'm an anarcho-communist." But he's like, practically, I'm a democratic socialist, which is a very mild form of socialism. And it was started, I think, in 1983 by this guy, Michael Harrington, who Catholic. I think he kind of distanced himself from religion kind of at the end because they were treating him so horribly. But he put democratic in front of socialist just to remind people like this is not authoritarian socialism. Right. Because mostly when you say socialism, instantly we think Stalin. I mean,
yeah,
and that's fair because he was a socialist, a communist. But so Michael Harrington was trying to emphasize, no, we're talking about democratic socialism, which is more what you see in the Nordic countries.
Right.
And a lot of socialist communists, like here in Berlin, I've tried to expose myself to a wide variety of people, and a lot of them do not like democratic socialists. They think that it's just prolonging capitalism. So yeah, they're like not for universal health care. They're not for college tuition. They're like strongly for local community only, pretty much. It's like they want to be small, self-sufficient, mutual aid communities.
It's almost like a hippie commune, like several hippie communes.
Yeah.
There is something to like localized government that makes so much more sense. And like Canada is pretty big. And we've got, like when you have a national government that doesn't necessarily understand your province, it can be frustrating. And so I think like in my province, Alberta, which is like super pro oil, when the world is becoming anti-oil, it's interesting because it's like you've got like a pretty progressive prime minister who's like saying, I'm going to get a pipeline built, which is like, okay, but like not everybody's going to be happy with you. And Alberta does not believe him that he's going to get it built, right? And so so what you see is like talks of separation, which I don't know how anybody takes that seriously, but so there's a lot going on there. And I think, for me, I'm thinking a lot about how like even, like anarchists, believing really in just small communities and giving all the power to that. And I'm like, I like that notion with still having kind of like a global perspective and saying, how do we make the world a better place? I was going to say globalist, but man, that's another bad word, right?
Yeah. That's definitely, I mean, there's a term neoliberal, and that's what Republicans and Democrats agree on. And it's very market capital centered. Yeah. And then I think another thing I would say is like with the socialist stuff, it came out of the first, I want to say the first like Marxist organization. I could be wrong on this, but they were called international. So there was the first international, the second international, and I think there was a third international. I think that was, I feel I should not be talking about this too much, but they were called first, second internationals. And their idea was that they wanted it to be a much more international, exactly as you're saying, like, okay, locally focused, but globally aware.
Yeah.
And that's why he also said workers of the world unite, is because he thought that it needs to be like, bigger than just a nation. And the earlier 1800s, that movement was also he was one of the first, Marx himself, I think it was Marx and the German Shakespeare named Goethe. They were the first two to start talking about world literature, because at the time everybody was focused on national literature and they wanted to build up their national identity. But Goethe and Marx were both very much interested in, okay, let's talk about a world literature now. So it is also a very international thing. And especially like what happened in Berlin, gosh, this is all like, I'm thinking of all the objections at the same time, and like there are many valid objections. Not what I would have thought, having grown up right wing. I thought that socialism meant government control, and then like I see this big old sign that says never trust the government, and I read social, so it's not what I thought. But I think I thought maybe this, I was thinking about this before, but there's two, I think, good critiques of socialism. One is by a literary person named Harold Bloom. And he said something like, socialism is a cry of despair more than it is a science. Um,
Hmm.
and so I think what he meant by that is sort of like, and I hate to do this because I'm advocating for these things, but I do want to give, I think these are good critiques. Um, so like the Green New Deal, for example,
Right.
Taxing wealthy, I mean, basically, and also even taking money from this like massively expensive United States military and investing it in green energy jobs,
Right.
um, infrastructure, all this stuff. I think that model is fantastic.
Hmm.
And I think if anybody could sit down and like be honest, like, and look at the amount of money that we spend on the United States military, it's like we could take some of that and invest it in clean energy, and it would help a lot.
Right.
But the issue is that potentially the technology is not quite there yet.
Yeah. Yep.
That is so like I think economically it makes a ton of sense, but the asterisk on it is that give us 10 more years and we might have much more efficient solar panels, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think that we are going to innovate our way out of this, but if we push it too fast, it's going to fail. Yeah.
that to me is the only, but I think like Bernie Sanders, AOC, Ed Markey, the people who put this together, I think are very willing to discuss that kind of stuff. But
Hmm.
what they're interested in is like, let's get away from these dangerous and expensive, and we're funding all kinds of bad things in the Middle East and we're destroying environments left and right
Yeah.
through all this reliance on oil. So
Hmm.
let's try to transition into some clean energy.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think
and
part of
they're
it too,
yeah.
like, I think like one of the things we should be doing is looking at, like, if we're going to use oil and gas, let's make sure we're using ethical oil and gas.
Mm-hmm,
Because there's a lot of
mm-hmm,
nations that we're dependent on. And like in Canada, Eastern Canada, they're using Saudi oil, and they
mm,
refuse to use Alberta oil because there's all this stuff about oil sands being awful, right? And it's like, okay,
mm,
but like we're more ethical than it would be in the Middle East. You know, like we
mm,
actually have environmental law we have to follow, right? And
mm-hmm,
human rights
mm-hmm,
law that we have to follow, right? And so that's
mm-hmm,
been, and it was really interesting because the Green Party of Canada, I remember seeing like before the election, they were like saying we should have a pipeline from, Alberta east and stop using Saudi oil. And I'm like, yeah, let's
mm-hmm,
not transport it using the ocean. Like that's awful, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I was like, that's interesting to hear the Green Party say, let's build a pipeline, right? But it's like, I
Mm-hmm,
think part of it too is like a lot of this, when we talk about environmentalism, people, there's a virtue signaling level of environmentalism, and then there's actually being practical and looking at, from a global perspective, what is really going on here? And like, are we
mm-hmm,
actually, like, we're transporting oil via the ocean from a country that has very different ethics,
yeah,
right? And it's like,
yeah,
but
yeah. And
sometimes. Mhm.
something that I found very exciting and comforting about the like socialist crowd that I interacted with in Berlin is that they are like, I would say probably like 70 or 80% are also sick of the virtue signaling. And
Yeah.
like one place
Yeah.
where this shows up is like, oh, a liberal, like everybody needs to use straws, you know?
Yeah.
And a socialist will say, okay, I will use a straw. I will use an alternative to straw. Like I'm not like gonna
Yeah.
throw a big fit about that. But 70 something percent of pollution is caused by the 100 biggest corporations. And
Hmm.
so me using a straw or not using a straw is like so minor in comparison to like the big change that needs to be made.
Hmm.
And we're allowing these companies to do that because we just let wealthy corporations do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah.
Because believe in private wealth. We believe in capital. So like we put capital at the top of our priority list. And so there's like, we need to drop capital and put society higher.
So essentially what we're seeing then is like, instead of, like, it's because we got like kind of Democrat versus Republican thing going on. And I mean, like, even in Canada, there's people that want to pretend they're Republicans or pretend they're Democrats when we don't really have the same kind of party system. But it's like, you've got the Republicans that are saying government for the people, let's make the government smaller, but let's reward the powerful by letting them climb the ladder as high as they want so they can control all of society. Whereas the Democrats have a tendency to say, well, let's take that power away from all the wealthy and let's give it to the government. And it's like neither side is actually looking at government for the people, right?
Yeah.
Or looking at, giving people more power. So the alternative then is building strong unions. It seems like building strong unions is the key to all of this. So have we seen countries actually do that?
I think, in Europe, I think the workers' unions are fairly strong as far as I'm aware of. And it's interesting because unions are, I think where we're at right now, I think unions are great. Because we've destroyed unions in the United States for the last 40 years. We've just decimated them to the point where, we've outsourced so many jobs. And that's all a capital decision,
Right.
I know a guy in the church that I grew up in, he had a factory in the US, and he, had to pay his workers $15 an hour, and he had to have like all kinds of like safety things. But then he was able to move his manufacturing overseas. So now there's a poor community in the U.S., and there's a community where he's paying his workers $3 a day abroad. And he's also promising them, no doubt, that like, if you work hard, we're going to bring you up in the company. But if he makes a decision based on capital, which he just made a very big one based on capital, then as soon as they become more efficient, he's going to phase workers out. He wants to lower the cost of capital. And as soon as he can pay a robot less to do it, he's going to do that because he has capital at the top of his priority.
Yeah.
And that's what we've allowed Bezos to do. It's what we've allowed Bill Gates to do. It's what we've allowed in the last. And so I was a libertarian because I believe in that small government line. And I saw the Republicans are like very hypocritical on this, especially because the military budgets they spend are massive. So like, small government is, in a Republican's mouth, is a lie. What they're against are social programs. They're for big government. They're against big community. So, but I wanted to stay consistent with that idea of small government, so I became a libertarian. But then it was this wealth inequality thing that I realized, okay, if we trim down all the regulations like we have done, there's a study that came out from 1989 to 2019, the wealthiest 1%, their value grew by $21 trillion.
Right.
The bottom 50% of the United States lost 900 billion over that same period.
Yeah.
So we have this insane, and even there's a great, I should, what's his name? Jeffrey Sachs. His name is Jeffrey Sachs. He's an economist. And he has this little video where he explains, this is from like 5 years ago as well. So it's even gotten worse since then. But he explains that Bill Gates, this was like in 2010 or 15 or something, it was 2010 to 2015, somewhere in there. Bill Gates was worth $63 billion. He was the most wealthy person. And he was like, I need to give money away, because he like saw the poverty and he's like, I need to be giving money. And so he went around and tried to convince other billionaires to give away 50% of their wealth in their lifetime.
Right.
and he started giving money like crazy. He averages $4 billion a year, and he's one of the best billionaires. He gives away a ton of money, $4 billion a year. So after 10 years of giving away $4 billion every year, and he was the richest man with 63 billion, he is now worth $96 billion. After giving away $4 billion every year, he cannot give it away fast enough. And so Jeffrey Sachs, he's like, there is such a gusher. And Jeff Bezos over the pandemic has increased only in 3 months, has increased his value by $48.6 billion. 3 months.
Yeah.
It would take him something like, it's the amount of wealth that we're talking about is like, well, I had a friend, he was like, oh, you're a socialist? Well, I have $19,000 in the bank. So what, do I just have to like pay it all the tax? I'm like, dude, I'm not talking about $19,000. I'm not talking about $190,000. I'm not talking about $1,900,000, you know? I'm not even talking about $190 million, you know? I'm talking about like infinitely more than that. Yeah, and I think one of the bills that Bernie introduced, it was called like for the 99.8%, because it was a tax that would only apply to the highest 0.2% of the United States. And, you know, you have all these libertarians who make $50,000 a year. They're like, you can't tax, you know, what? And he's like, it's for the 99.8%. This does not even apply to you. This applies to freaking Bill Gates, and there's 2,200 billionaires in the world. So it's like, I don't even know if 0.2%, that must include all the billionaires. That must.
So do you think that like unionizing could be more of a grassroots movement as opposed to like trying to take over the government, give them a whole bunch of power, and then convince them to like restructure?
Definitely. In particular, I think one of the best kind of grassroots level is probably worker-owned co-ops. And you see this, there's like a bakery in San Francisco that is extremely successful. It's a worker-owned co-op. And there are more and more organizations that are popping up that are worker-owned co-ops. And there's like a lot of like bike repair places, you know?
So basically from the get-go, you have a group of workers that own the business.
Exactly. So it's not a one-person CEO, like, you know, I have the capital, you have the labor. I'm trying to maximize profit while dropping, like my goal is to get rid of the labor costs, you know? It's not advantageous for the workers to get shafted in a worker-owned co-op model.
And I think that's what's interesting too. And like I've talked to a very, you know, there's a guy I've had on the podcast a few times that's like just very much capitalism, like doesn't believe in minimum wage, like all this stuff that I'm like, I still don't understand how you think this is practical, because it's kind of like that Adam Smith, you know, people will do the right thing if they look out for their self-interest. But even talking to him, he's like, I don't like big business. I want small businesses to succeed. So I think if we consider small business and we can, you know, we build up small business, I think that's something all of us can agree on, is like strong small businesses as worker co-ops. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. And it's funny how it's so hard to find that common ground, because I think, and I said this yesterday when I was talking to a bunch of people, I'm like, you guys are being played. You know, when you get polarized, you are being played. And, you know, whatever side it is, if you're fully on board with a political party, I guarantee you are being played right now.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to think there's like a new thing that's popping up that's called the People's Party. And I mean, I would like to think that one is, their ideals are much better. And Cornel West.
That means a different thing in Canada.
Does it? Wait,
there's the People's Party. So there's a guy who was on the conservative. He was in the Conservative Party in Canada. He ran for the leadership, lost,
Mm-hmm.
And then he started posting all this like anti-immigration stuff, right? And when he got basically canceled by that party, and then he was like, well, I'm going to start my own party, and he called it the People's Party of Canada. And so there's a lot of talk about the People's Party being racist and all this stuff. So it's just funny. But the notion of a People's Party, if I forget the Canadian definition, what is that?
I mean, of the people, by the people, for the people, and it would be like a worker-centric party. So, you know, policies that it would be, you know, for a Green New Deal. It would be for. I mean, it's like the two big speakers at this event will be Nina Turner, who would likely have been Bernie Sanders' vice president, and Cornel West, who was a surrogate for Bernie Sanders. Those are like two of the big names. So it would be coming out of that. And I mean, Cornel West has endorsed Biden, saying he's a milquetoast neoliberal. I think he calls Trump a neo-fascist catastrophe and Biden a neoliberal disaster. But
great choices there, right?
yeah, exactly. So so he says, yeah, I'm going to vote for Biden to vote against Trump. And he didn't do that. He didn't do that in the first 2016. He didn't endorse Hillary Clinton. He wouldn't do it. He said, I'm not going to sell my soul for a mess of pottage. Like, he's like, I have like my integrity, and Hillary Clinton's too tied to Wall Street. Too much war mongering. Not doing anything for poor and working people. And he says he has the same critique of Joe Biden. Like, he's not going to be the person that we need, but he's not Trump. And so he says, you know, I'll vote for Biden, but day one, I'm Biden's biggest critic. And that's also like essentially the way I feel. I mean, I pretty much just I do whatever Cornel West says. So. Kidding, but also kind of serious.
It's funny how that works, hey? Because like I always think of myself as a very independent thinker, and there's few people, you know, like I've listened to the Holy Post podcast a lot, and like Skye Jitani,
Phil Vischer. Oh yeah,
and Skye Jitani, every time he opens his mouth, I'm like, this guy's making sense. And I'm like, I'm supposed to not, you know, align with anybody because I'm an Enneagram 4. I'm my own person, but it's like a lot of times it's just like it just rings so true. I'm like, I like that guy.
Yeah.
So I gotta look into some Cornel West though, because I know he's crazy popular. So.
Yeah, definitely. Like, yeah, YouTube is great. Yeah, he's just very quotable and very. I've read a ton of his like deeper level stuff too, and there are a few things that I can critique with him, but like basically everything he's thought it through way more than I have. You know, he's lived through so much. He's paid attention for a long time.
Yeah.
Tupac was one of his students, actually.
Oh, interesting.
He was like in an elementary school, I guess. But yeah, he was the first African American to graduate with a PhD in philosophy from Princeton. He's taught at Harvard, Yale, the Sorbonne in Paris, like. And he's very like centered on Martin Luther King. Like for him, he's trying to keep alive the legacy of Martin Luther King, pretty much. So I mean, Cornel West's not a preacher, but he's, but everybody thinks he is because that's his style. He's like totally that style. He's not, doesn't work for a church, but.
I'm definitely going to delve into that. Okay, so there anything else you wanted to say about socialism?
We didn't talk about the Haymarket Affair. I think that's
that?
A really good example. I'm just kind of going through the notes here, but the Haymarket Affair was really interesting because I think this is when a lot of our modern understandings come from. Okay. And I'll try to do it sort of fast, but there was Cyrus McCormick Sr. Have you heard of McCormick, like grain harvesters? You heard of that before?
No. I know nothing.
Okay. Well, in my world, you know, I grew up on a ranch, so you would see kind of some of this stuff around. And there's a car company called the International Scout, and that came from the same lineage. I think it was called International Harvester. I think it became that, but it originally was the McCormick Grain Harvester.
Oh, okay. So it's a piece of equipment. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tractor basically.
Right.
That he, pulled these workers together and he said, okay, we're going to make this grain harvester. And it was wildly successful. They made a ton of money. And it was, I think he sent his son, Cyrus McCormick Jr., off to Princeton in the 1880s to study economics. And he did that. And then he came back with all these ideas about efficiency. And so McCormick Sr. died. And that year they had a huge profit like normal. And the workers were saying, hey, we can actually accomplish this in 8 hours a day. Like, we're getting really efficient. We don't have to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week like we have been. Right. We could do the same amount in 8 hours. And McCormick Jr. said, yeah, you could do that, but you're just advocating that because you're lazy. And what are you going to do with that extra 2 hours? All you're going to do is drink beer. And instead, I'm just going to get rid of half of you. And so he got rid of half of his workers. Understandably, they were upset. Even his own mother was like, what are you thinking? Like, these are people that have been helping our family for forever, and you just got rid of them. And he was like, it's just efficiency. The 50% left, they should be happy that I'm giving them a job at all. And this was a common thing in Chicago in the 1880s. And so working people were understandably pretty upset. It created a lot of ghettos because now all of a sudden, you have this super concentrated wealth, and you have a lot of poor and destitute people that move to Chicago to like assist these people. But then, as they become more efficient, they just get pushed out, less money. So there was all these kind of like worker agitation and worker riots at that time. Protests, but understandably, like, things got more and more tense, and McCormick Jr. he was wealthy enough and connected enough in the society that he just said, oh, these people are just they're lazy, they don't want to work 8 hours. I mean, they don't want to work 10 hours, and they were all asking for an 8-hour workday. That was the big thing, right? So he hired the police, he hired private guards, he was in control of the newspapers, and he said, oh, these people are all lazy. Look at them. They just want to drink beer. That's all they want to do. And so it culminated in this Haymarket affair. I think it was May 1st. This is why May Day exists. And it was a peaceful protest, but the police, I think it was like 4:00 in the afternoon, the police were like, okay, everybody's got to go. You guys are done. Everybody get out. So they started marching to push the people out of their protest area. And somebody threw a bomb. It killed one of the police officers and it injured like 7 other people. And so instantly they knew who the leaders of the worker movement was, and they went straight to those leaders and arrested 8 of them. 7 of them were not even at the place. And they accused them of making the bomb and inciting violence. And I mean, behind the scenes, they were definitely, they were getting upset because, like, what are they supposed to do? A lot of them had kids to feed, and they were all getting less and less money from McCormick. And he was just telling them, like, you've got to deal with it. I'm sorry. So what ended up happening is he ended up firing all his workers and hiring all new workers at 8 hours a day. And basically everybody's really upset at him. He had a horrible crisis. And so he decided to hire this preacher who had been asking for money to build a school that would train Christian workers. And that preacher's name is Dwight Moody. And so yes. Dwight Moody used to put all the wealthy people behind him when he gave a talk. And he emphasized a plain reading of the Bible. And he emphasized that if you work hard and you're not lazy, you don't drink beer, then you will get a job. And you'll be financially successful. And look, because God has blessed Cyrus J. McCormick with wealth. And so God could also bless you with wealth if you work hard and do what Cyrus McCormick says.
Wow.
So the labor movement, organized labor, uses Haymarket as like a rallying cry because they're like, we need to stick together and we need to not just do whatever the capitalist, the wealthy person says. And our version of Christianity that we follow is very related to doing exactly what the capital person has to say, because we define God in the way that they define God. And it's an individual thing. We don't talk about systemic stuff. We don't criticize the people behind Dwight Moody, et cetera, et cetera. And so this goes on through history. This is what I want to write my master's thesis about, is about this relationship, the Christianity that gets developed out of this particular relationship.
That's fascinating.
So Haymarket's super interesting. May 1st, I think it actually blew up on May 4th. 4 of those people or 3 of them were hung very quickly.
Wow.
One of them committed suicide in prison.
Wow.
So the story goes. The other 4 sat in jail for 7 years until a governor of Illinois looked at the case and realized, oh my gosh, this is like super unjust. And so he let the other 4, he granted them, he pardoned them, the other 4, because it was pretty seriously just a very unjust situation that was created by Cyrus McCormick Jr. Yeah.
What a mess.
So, yeah.
My gosh. All right. Well, this was very informative. I look forward to listening to this when I edit it.
Good. Yeah.
So if people want to get in touch with you or see what you're doing, you said Instagram is probably the best place?
Yeah, I do a lot of stuff on Instagram, and my handle is New Transcendentalist, which is like a connection to Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau, Margaret Fuller. They were called the New England Transcendentalists, and I just connected with the way that they saw things. Theodore Parker is one of these. So yeah, New Transcendentalist is probably the best place. And I'm on Medium. I'm on a few places with that name. So New Transcendentalist.
Perfect. We can link all that in the show notes.
Totally. Cool. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thanks for coming on. We will definitely do this again sometime.
All right. Sounds good.
There's much. Losing my ego, fighting on the placebo. Little do we know, it's more than a training, it's a revolution.